So we're just going to jump right into it. I'm Mick Dumke from ProPublica. That's your cue, Ben.
Yeah, Ben Jarofsky from The Reader and WCPT.
And in case, how many people were here this afternoon? Were there people who were here earlier? All right. So there's some people who, along with Ben, have been talking politics basically all day. Ben, afternoon radio show was held live here this afternoon, right? So
man.
Ben's on double duty.
Double duty, can't get enough political talk. Just going to keep talking about it. Even after I'm in bed, I'll be like, blah, 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 blah. On the other hand,
what that really means is if all you guys just get your spitballs ready. If Ben starts nodding off, just take aim. All right, not going to happen. All right, let's get into it. This is, I think I can speak for you, Ben, on this. This is one of our favorite shows. When we do the election, when we come before the election, we gather groups of some of our favorite journalists, and Lorraine and Dave are certainly in that group, and we talk about what's been happening, what we think is going to happen. So without wasting any more time, let's get right into it. Right on the end, Lorraine Forte is, you were the executive editor at the Chicago Reporter most recently, and you're currently transitioning to the Chicago Sun-Times editorial board, right?
Yes. On Monday, I'll be starting as the newest member of the Sun-Times editorial board. And I was a reporter at the Sun-Times a while back, and so I have met and kind of know Dave Mckinney. But I'm really excited to be going back, and it's going to be an interesting time to be on the editorial board with all the goings on in Chicago and across Illinois and across the rest of the country.
And in case people don't know how newspapers work exactly, what does that mean that you're on the editorial board?
Well, the editorial board is the group that decides on endorsements for political candidates. The editorials that you read, the unsigned editorials that you read, are written by the editorial writers, which, you know, if you're on the editorial board, that's part of what you do. Edit the opinion pieces that appear in the paper written by, guest columnists, and also to help select the letters to the editor. So you're really, the editorial board is really the voice of the paper, more or less.
All right. And Dave Mckinney, sitting right next to me, which is, this is your return trip to First Tuesdays at the Hideout. Dave, last time we were here was not nearly as happy of circumstances. For those of you who may have been here, Dave had resigned from the Sun-Times, and maybe I'll let you tell a little bit of the story, but this was after this very heated, in this very heated environment during the 2014 elections, after you had been doing some kick-ass reporting and some pressure came down from the Rauner camp. First, I believe you were suspended. Then at a certain point in time, you just said this didn't sit right with you, and you end up walking away. While after me saying, why don't you tell the story, here I am telling the story. Anyway, Dave is now at WBEZ, continuing his kick-ass reporting. Dave, welcome back.
Well, thanks. Thanks very much. And congratulations. That's great news.
Thank you. It's really exciting.
You won't have Michael Farrow dictating what your editorials are anymore, huh?
Yeah, well,
things have changed at the Sun.
Things
We
have
should
changed
indicate
at the
that.
Sun-Times. I think the new owners are really committed to it. So.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah. Well, that's good. Well, thanks for having me back. I appreciate it.
Sure. Wait, I can't remember. You were suspended? I don't remember that part of the story. It's only 4 years ago.
It was a surreal kind of deal. And I remember when I was here, I mean, you were trying like crazy to get me to open up and just blab about it, and it was right before the election, and I didn't want to. I just didn't want to be accused by anybody of trying to influence things for or against Rauner, you know. So, but
thanks a lot for nothing.
Yeah, I know, but now is now.
Oh, what a heck of a governor he's turned out to be.
But yeah, no, that was a wild experience. I got to say that. I mean, we had a story. I don't know if anybody remembers it, but it was back in I think we started working on it with the first tip in maybe late August of 2014. We had gotten a tip that there had been a lawsuit involving one of the companies GTCR, Rauner's former private equity firm, had set up. and it was failing, or it had failed, and there was litigation that involved the former CEO that Rauner had picked, and he was just basically trying to shut the place down, trying to get rid of her. Had moved to Terminators, I remember, and we stumbled across this court case that included a deposition from him, and then her own words. I mean, there was just a lot of really forceful language in there where, the acrimony between him and her got so heated where I think, and he got frustrated that he couldn't get rid of her as quickly as he wanted. He said, I can turn you radioactive, or, if you don't get out of here, I could hurt you and your family, in terms of not, probably financially, I mean, that's how I read it. But it was a big story, and we took 6 weeks to nail it down, interviews, paper trail, and everything else. And we get to the point of publishing, and, really at the just very last moment, there was a campaign aide that said, look, we don't believe this is a story, and we're gonna go around you, and that's basically what happened. And they attempted to kill the story, and to the credit of Jim Kirk, who is now at Tronc,
I think is the editor of the L.A. Times at the moment.
At the moment,
yeah.
Right?
Wait, they were sold though.
I think
that's why I added
tangent
at the
within a
moment.
tangent.
Anyway, he was the editor of the
caveat.
Sun-Times at the time,
Yeah.
right?
But he just he hit the send button, to his credit, and that story got out. And then within a day or two, the shit hit the fan basically, and they. Kirk had to come back and say that we've gotten a complaint about the story. Your wife is a political consultant, and therefore you're biased, and she's working on the Quinn campaign, and none of that was true. It was not true in any way, shape, or form. And
It was true that you had a wife.
It's true I had a wife, and I fell in love with her. And it was just a deal where we had been clear about that relationship from the beginning, and the paper had made their determination they were going to, let me cover the election, and so we were doing it, and then it just got kind of crazy, and here we are. So anyway, but it's like you learn, man. It was a wild ride, but I'm happy, very happy where I'm at.
Well, we're happy you're working as a reporter again, covering the state political beat, because you're one of the best at it. One of the things we like to do before we get into the nitty-gritty of the elections, though, is we heard a little bit about you guys, but tell us a little bit, how did you get into journalism? Lorraine, how did you end up at the Sun-Times the first time, let alone the second time? Why are you still doing this?
Well, I guess I first got into journalism. Growing up, there was always a newspaper in our house, so the news was on. And, one of my jobs as a kid was, my dad would give me a quarter and say, go buy the paper. So grew up reading newspapers, magazines, watching news all the time. Fast forward, I ended up going to journalism school here at Northwestern, and kept getting jobs somehow. I worked at the Daily Southtown, which, for those of you who don't know, was a suburban newspaper, and did some other things. Eventually I landed at the Sun-Times, and I've taught journalism at Columbia College, and I actually worked for a while as a writer and producer at WGN, so I've done a little television. And most recently, as you noted, I was at the Chicago Reporter as the executive editor, and got a call asking if I was interested in being on the editorial board. And I'm like, sure. So I went in, for a couple of interviews, and they offered me the job. So, it's exciting.
Ben and I are also alums of the Chicago Reporter, and for those who don't know, this is a like a 46-year-old?
Yeah, 46-year-old.
Started in the early 70s as basically a newsletter that covered, did investigative reporting on racial disparities.
Right, race and inequality, and now it's digital, all digital, it's all online. Still covering, race and inequality in a city where that's, really the the dominant story. I mean, if not across the country, but certainly here in Chicago.
I was going to say, during the Trump era, did the job change at all? I mean, was there heightened interest in what you were doing, or were you guys like, we've already been doing these things long before other people were paying attention?
The reporter had already been doing it for, as you know, 40-some years, and I think it's just raised the profile of the issue, nationally. It's always been a big issue here in Chicago, but just nationally, it's something that, news is paying a lot more attention to, issues of race and inequality and class and inequity. So, yeah.
Dave, what's your tale? How did you end up here? Yeah.
You know what? I thought growing up I was going to be a writer for Rolling Stone, and that never happened. So I think we all thought that or something. But I got involved in journalism at my alma mater, Eastern Illinois, and worked at the paper there. And, to this day, they have this really cool credo under the masthead that is tell the truth and don't be afraid. And it's like, who doesn't want to live by that credo? It's kind of what we're all about. I started out at the Daily Herald out in the northwest suburbs. Started just covering suburban governments and, wrote all kinds of crazy stories about, 15-pound babies being born and tornadoes and fires and, all kinds of crazy stuff like that. Actually, the baby story, that is the one and only time that the National Enquirer has ever followed my story. And I kid you not.
You scooped him.
Yeah.
It really was a 15-pound baby?
Well, it might have been 14, but it was like this massive baby in Schaumburg. And it's like, wow, this is not Rolling Stone, baby. This is... So, I don't know. From there, I went to the Sun-Times. I'd always wanted to work there because I remember in college reading a book that... that Pam Zeckman and Bill Rechtenwald and Zay Smith wrote about their experience at the Mirage, and I was really inspired by that. And I thought, man, that is what journalism is about. And so anyway, I latched on there, and it worked out where there was an opening in their State House bureau. I love politics, got involved in it, and it was really kind of a golden time in Springfield when I started and left. I mean, to get to know a state senator, who became president. Got to cover George Ryan's administration, to cover Blagojevich's administration, to be involved in covering their corruption trials. I mean, it was just like, wow, that is a lot of stuff,
Well, you talk about Springfield. Let's just start in Springfield and work our way up. When you started, I'm sure there was a powerful man in the State House named Michael Madigan, who's still there. But it seems like the unthinkable is happening in the state of Illinois. There's actually a sense that he may be in trouble politically. Ask both of you. So I'll start with you, Dave, though. Do you think that the recent allegations about sexual harassment that he sort of overlooked for 3 months could be the beginning of the end of his reign, or will he survive this?
You know what? There's so many unknowns with that. I wished I could predict what the future is. I mean, I certainly know he doesn't want to, tarnish that whatever the legacy is of being around that long with this. But I think if there is another shoe to drop, if there are other cases that emerge, then that's going to put pressure on the statewide gubernatorial nominee to call for him to step down as party chairman. And look, we're not going to have another speaker election until the start of until next January, and it'll be interesting to see how people rally around him. I mean, he's still. I think it's interesting how there still have not been, outside of Elena Hampton and Denise Rothheimer prior to that, there still have not been a lot of women in that culture who have come forward and not only identified themselves but pointed fingers. And when Madigan came out with that list in late February of 9 different cases that had come through his office, one of the things about that really struck me was how 3 of those cases involved legislators. And we don't have any idea, A, who they are. We don't know for sure if they're Democrats. We don't know if they're on the 2018 ballot. And that's something that voters, I think, might want to know.
Well, okay, yeah. That's a good point. They might want to. There's a lot of things that voters should want to know about what's going on these days. But Lorraine, what do you think? Do you think Madigan, this is enough to finally move him out of Springfield? Or
Yeah, I think like what Dave said, if there's more allegations that come forth, or if we find out who these unknown people are and they turn out to be people who are running that no one has said anything about, there are a lot of women running for office, and a lot of women geared up to vote. And in the moment that we're in, maybe it is something that eventually, brings him down. But he's been around for so long. I mean, when was he not speaker? I mean,
there was a time.
Right.
was a time.
Actually,
he's
in the
been
90s.
a speaker for like.
Well, what were we all doing in 1971? I was in
Yeah,
first grade.
I wasn't even living.
Being born.
So
Yeah,
it's like,
right.
so it's the only speaker I've ever heard of here in Illinois.
Well, I will give Bruce Rauner credit for something. On Monday was Pulaski Day, I guess that was just yesterday, right? Pulaski Day. And I don't know if you guys saw this. It was either Bruce Rauner, I think it was his campaign, released a statement that said, on Pulaski Day, let's remember that Mike Madigan has been speaker longer than Casimir Pulaski was alive.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Oh,
I was like, that's really a way to get in the spirit of Pulaski
celebrating
Day.
Pulaski Day.
That's pretty
any
hilarious.
excuse he has to mention Rauner. For Rauner to mention Madigan. One thing I've been struck by, and get your comments on this one, is the relative passivity, I guess is a word, of Democratic legislators. They're not very forceful in speaking out about the allegations and calling for investigations, in contrast to, let's say, the expressions of outrage coming out of Hollywood on a regular basis whenever there's any kind of accusation. And it seems as though the power is still there. There's a timidity on the part of Democratic legislators.
Right. I mean, this isn't Hollywood, and people, when you're part of a party that's so, in a body that's so, where your party is so controlled by one person, you're not gonna say anything. I'm not surprised that people aren't jumping up to say anything, because who wants to be the one to take him on? If you're part of that party, it's like toe the line, because if you can't bring him down, then he's just a wounded animal, and that's not good.
So there's not a sense, God, I feel so naive about the words about to come out of my mouth. But doesn't it matter? Doesn't principle ever play a role? Or is it just, I'm sorry for even thinking that. I'm really apologize, people.
This stuff is hard. I mean,
it's like when your livelihood depends on something, and you're part of this, really tight-knit group, or tight-knit group that's controlled by one person. Are you going to jump up and be the one to say something, unless you can bring someone down?
Well, when you talk about livelihood, though, I mean, you're
Right.
not just talking about legislators. You're talking about generations of lobbyists, generations of, everybody over the last 30 years who does business in Springfield in one way or another has to have spent time in the speaker's office to get something.
Well, that's true, yeah.
Yeah. And they're going to have to go back to the speaker.
Right, they're gonna have to
Oh,
go back.
sorry, boss. Lorraine made me do it. I didn't want to say anything.
well, this stuff is really hard, of course, too, right? I mean, to come forward for an allegation to surface that has enough, enough specifics attached to it to bring someone as powerful as Mike Madigan down. You usually need names, dates, details about what happened. All the other, so-called Me Too scandals, powerful men who have fallen from that, all that stuff was percolating for years. Everybody, so many people knew about Harvey Weinstein, right? So many people in retrospect knew about Charlie Rose, for that matter. And it's like, it took a certain point in time before there were enough people who felt empowered to say or do something about it.
I mean, I just remember that culture there where, I would have, they every year there would be a new intern that we would get from the University of Illinois. They had a reporting program there that turned out a lot of great journalists. But every year I would get a young woman, I would always kind of preface it. It's like, all right, be really careful when you go out there, because you're going to have people hitting on you, and it's going to get uncomfortable. And lo and behold, it happened to just about every one of them I had. And I, on one hand, people like that are adults. I get that. But on the other hand, they've got a job to do, and you know, to be sitting in a press box and having a legislator come up and hand you a sheet of paper, if you get lonely, call this number, kind of thing. I mean, that kind of stuff, that's the culture. It was the culture. And you know, it's probably gone underground now, but, you know, it's a colorful place.
No, I was just, that's a pretty mild example.
Yeah.
Some things that can.
I know it's an easy one.
You know, if you get lonely, call me. Well,
Yeah.
Well, I have a journalistic ethics question, if those two words can be put together. And this has been on my mind a lot. I've been asking a lot of journalists this question. So I think I may have asked Mick this one the other day, so he can answer it as well. This has to do with the Tribune's rather selective release of tapes, recordings of conversations between Blagojevich and Pritzker, and they've been rather effectively used by Rauner in his commercials to blemish Pritzker and to cause problems for him. What's your thoughts on this? All of you guys, is the Tribune under any obligation, in your humble opinion, to give a little more explanation as to where they got the tapes, or what the source of the tapes are, or how many more of them are out there, or in your humble opinion, are they just free to just selectively release them whenever it fits their purpose?
I mean, these are supposed to be under seal, correct?
That is correct.
Right. So
the judge sealed.
We have established that.
Yeah.
So, but you know, at the same time, I wouldn't expect them or anybody else to come out and identify, you know, a law enforcement source or a defense lawyer or whoever it might be, that decided for whatever reason to give these over. And it might well have been associated with a book project that you know, Jeff Cohen and John Chase were involved with a few years ago with Blagojevich. They might have been sitting around for a period of time. I mean, I could be wrong, but that's my general sense of it. And you know, look, we're in an election. You know, you go back, and I've had that happen to me before, where you'll stumble across, you know, a state contract or something that like, well, it doesn't mean anything today, but in a year or two, it means something. And suddenly it's like, well, yeah, of course. And so when you've got J.B. Pritzker, you know, I don't know that 2 years ago, if that's when they got these tapes, that they would have trotted out that we've got a story here about J.B. Pritzker. It wouldn't have had the same kind of punch to it as it does now.
What's your thoughts?
When you say selectively release, I mean, are there other tapes that we don't?
Well, we don't know.
About?
That's part of what they should explain to us.
I honestly don't. Yeah, what would I do if I had tape? I mean, there is news value to it, but you know, I wouldn't, as Dave said, I wouldn't expect them to say where they got them or, you know, who gave them to them. But yeah, I don't know. That's kind of, I don't know.
Tough one, huh?
I don't.
What's your opinion, Ben? What would you?
I mean,
what's
you
your
know,
thought
unless
about
you're
it?
breaking the law or something by releasing them. I mean.
Well, I, you know, still got enough of that reporter in me that you should protect your source.
Right.
So,
Right.
and people go to jail to protect sources.
That's right.
So, if the Tribune, they should protect their source. On the other hand, I believe that they have an obligation to place these tapes, these recordings, in a greater context if they have the ability to do so. So they have to tell us what came before and what came after, particularly the last ones, which were the ones where they were plotting how to maneuver to get Jesse White from the Secretary of State's office to the senator's vacancy so that they can then fill the Secretary of State's position with somebody else who would be compliant to them and they control those jobs. So did that conversation just, what did it emerge from? What did it come from?
But does that really matter? I mean, you know, does that somehow make what Pritzker and Blagojevich said somehow more acceptable if you put it in a different, not acceptable, but I mean, what's the what does it matter what the context is?
I don't think in any way you can make it acceptable what they said because there was just a strain of prejudice throughout what they said. But I think it would be more meaningful and it would allow us, the listeners, the readers of the Chicago Tribune, and everybody else out there, to have a sense of like how it fit into a larger pattern. The whole way they released it, it was so bizarre. I don't know if anybody here beside me read the article, but sometimes they feel I'm the only one who reads newspapers anymore. But it was embedded in an article about race relations in the election.
You're talking about a couple different things. Would they? I mean, if I had edited that story, I would have put the tape stuff at the lead and cut the other half of the story, which wasn't very interesting, frankly. I don't know who made the decision, and I don't like to play media critic because we all write stuff that we think is great, and it turns out not to be that great. It's hard. I mean, it's hard to do this well. So, but they had a great scoop that you're right, Ben. They may have teased it in the headline, as I recall, but then they buried it in the middle of this really long story. Like it was the full page of the Trib. Like you unfold the paper and it's the full page. And the stuff about the actual text, the conversation was way in the middle of that. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is, should they have provided more of the context? If they can, if it illuminates anything, sure, that's fair. But I agree with the rest of the panel here. You don't talk about your sources. You don't talk about what you don't have or what you do have. Our responsibility as reporters is we collect information. We make sure it's sound. If we and our editors believe it's in the public interest, we find the best way we can to present it to the public. And that's what we do. There's always something we still have that we didn't release. We may have chosen not to release. Right? I mean, there always is.
I don't know if that's a fair answer. I mean, in this particular, if there's more that they didn't release, that would in any way give us a fuller picture of what happened, then they owe it to release it. Just imagine if what Trump would do in this case.
What I'm saying is, as a judgment call, selective. You always have more material. Your column only, I don't know how much space they give you these days, Ben. Let's say it's 800 words. You have 1,200 words worth of material. You're cutting 400 words, whether you like it or not. Maybe you're going to put it back later. Most of it ends up just cut. Let's face it. In a lot of instances, you're able to continue to follow up. And so you use that material for something else if it's worthwhile. Other times it's not. I'm just saying we make these judgment calls all the time. And I don't think it's necessarily unfair. I think a lot of times we keep stuff out in the interest of fairness.
But what about I mean, there have to be hours and hours and hours and hours of tapes that are in the possession of the U.S. Attorney's Office.
Yeah.
And presumably. And, you could argue, well, hey, you've had a successful prosecution, multiple ones. Why not release that? But I don't see it.
I agree with that point a whole
But at the same time, it's like they didn't use that evidence to convict somebody. So I get the point of, not putting it out. But
the Blagojevich people wanted the tapes released, and the feds wouldn't release it. And they got the judge to agree with them to prevent their being released. Now we're seeing bits and pieces. Listen, if there's a third conversation that's released, like in October when Rauner's running against Pritzker, then we really should be asking the Tribune, all right, what's going on here? I mean, you had the stuff, you let it go, dribble it out bits and pieces. Why don't you bring it all out at one time? Why are you selecting? When do you determine the news value the news value of it? Is this fair to Pritzker?
You know what, Pritzker though, he knows if there are more, because I mean it's a finite period of time from when they put a wire on John Wyma, the lobbyist and former aide, and when they wiretapped the campaign offices, and when he was arrested. You're talking about a 6 to 8 week period. Pritzker even today would know how many conversations he had.
Could you
with
imagine the conversation between Pritzker and his handlers? All right, what else did you say?
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if anybody else has ever listened to or seen, tape, videotape, audio tape of like government surveillance. Most of it is unlistenable. Either you literally can't hear it, or it's people talking about their breakfast. So this is all by nature. It's all cherry picked, right?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm still going back to like, what other context would you expect there to be? They're
I don't
sitting
know.
there figuring out, who's the most acceptable black person they can get. That's what they're doing. I mean, that's
yeah, I don't
and
know.
That's how.
I don't know.
There'd be a lot of other embarrassing.
Yeah, there could
Right,
be other
and to be
embarrassing
even
stuff.
more embarrassing.
Yeah.
With other
So
political
the
leaders
more-
and-
Yeah, I have no idea what's on it. That's why I want them all out. The only thing I can think that comes close to it, it involves the Tribune as well. This was many, many years ago. Believe it or not, a guy, I think his name was Skip Burrell, I want to say his name was, and he was a lower level like precinct captain in the 3rd Ward, and there was a vacancy for 3rd Ward alderman, and he wanted to be appointed by Harold Washington to fill the vacancy. And so he went, but Harold was going to appoint Dorothy Tillman. And so Skip went into the mayor's apartment, I want to say, with a tape recorder in his pocket, taped the conversation, all right? So it's already illegal.
Wasn't Harold Washington cooking food or something like that?
I don't know.
It was like he caught him like in his pajamas,
Yeah,
and he's like taping him.
Well, no,
illegally.
Harold invited him because he knew him because he was precinct captain of the 3rd Ward, and Harold came out of the 3rd Ward. And somehow or other, I can't remember how, but it landed up, a transcript of the conversation landed up in the Tribune, and really embarrassed Harold Washington because he was saying all kinds of nasty things about Dorothy Tillman, and I think he called her a thoroughly unlikable person or something like that. Harold always had a way with words. But my recollection is that the Tribune pretty much ran the entire transcript. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So
You know what's kind of what I've thought about some, and I don't have an answer, but what was the calculus inside the Rauner campaign to use these ads now? I mean, I know the timing of the paper, the timing of the publication of the story was one thing, but look, if you're betting safe odds that Rauner is the nominee on the Republican side and Pritzker is the nominee on the Democratic side, and I'm not saying that's the case, but if that's what people are thinking about, why not save that until about October 15th or October 1st and run them then?
That's a great. You got any thoughts on that?
Other than to try and weaken him while you can, and then maybe somebody else becomes the nominee, and there's an easier in their mind path to a second term if they can get enough people to knock off the other billionaire that's got the only person that has enough money to of their own to go up against Rauner.
Yeah, it's interesting because it does seem to suggest that Rauner's camp has determined that Pritzker's the more difficult to beat for because he has the billions for about $1 billion reasons.
For $1 billion
Yeah.
reasons.
Yeah.
Several billion.
So, yeah, I was surprised by that too. They're just coming early.
Well, let me ask you guys on that point while we're talking about the governor's race. Is Pritzker the person? And I know, I'm not asking you to endorse him or anything like that. What do you see right now? What is your sense of things?
Well, I mean, I think I asked you this, Ben, earlier. Isn't the undecideds about the same percentages of people who have already decided between either, Pritzker or who is
Kennedy
it today?
or
Okay, so yesterday it was Biss, and now, so there's still a lot of votes apparently in play, so I don't know who it could be. I suppose if I had to lay odds, I would say probably Pritzker, because people think, well, he's the one that's got plenty of money to go up against Rauner. But it could, there's still enough people who are undecided to turn it to someone else.
What's your sense, Dave?
You know what, your point earlier, and I can't remember if the mics were on when we were talking about it or not, but just if this is a low turnout election, then organizational support carries a lot more meaning. And of course that works, somewhat to Pritzker's advantage with the union support. But Biss with the Bernie Sanders crowd. And I also think Kennedy is kind of in an interesting spot too, because he's managed to kind of navigate a path through all of this without being subject to too many attack ads. I mean, he's been kind of quiet and just kind of in the backdraft of Pritzker and Biss, Pritzker and Rauner, and I just know that none of these polls matter. They're they're usually wrong, and these races always tend to narrow at the end, and I think the governor's race is a good one. I mean, that AG's race, we could end up with a tie for that one. I mean, I don't know.
All right, well, hold that thought for a second. Let's talk about the Republicans for a minute. We're all presuming Bruce Rauner is going to be the nominee. What does Jeannie Ives do to Rauner? And I say that because all of a sudden he sounds like he's a little warmer toward Donald Trump. He's sort of picked up a little bit of the right-wing rhetoric again, it sounds like. So is she just a temporary nuisance for him that he sort of bats away and keeps going on? I asked that because I think it was interesting that he started running ads against her. I mean, he's got a whole website, Madigan's favorite Republican, I think it's called, which is pretty funny. The whole concept of it. But.
Yeah. But I mean, when did all that start? It started after that Tribune editorial board debate, when I think the consensus was that she really cleaned his clock, and so he's got history on his side with these primaries, these gubernatorial primaries. I mean, you have to go back to 1976. That was the last time, I believe, that an incumbent governor was knocked off in a primary. Walker and Howlett. Yeah. And so what you find instead, like in the 90s, you have these conservative candidates. Like I remember Steve Baer ran against Edgar Roser, ran a couple of times, and they would typically draw 25% of the vote. And that's the real big struggle that Jeannie Ives has. That you've got that that number to start with, and how do you build that up? And she's had whatever it is, $2.5 million from Dick Uihlein, the Lake Forest businessman, to get her on the air. But those ads, they've cut both ways, I think.
She certainly hasn't been trying to pick up anybody in the center, has she?
No, she's not. Yeah. She's not. And I think it's a real struggle for her. I mean, I think she's run a surprisingly strong race given what everybody's expectations were. But history is against her.
Well, she came into Chicago yesterday. I don't know if you saw this. That was your homework assignment, to read the story. Did you do your homework assignment?
I did read it.
Okay, I sent her the article.
I did read it.
You read this. It was in today's...
This is what we do to our guests.
Yeah.
I did read the story. I did my homework.
Okay, there's going to be a quiz on the article. But no, the article talked about how she had that press conference yesterday downtown Chicago with the alderman from the 41st Ward. And Napolitano, and they were blasting this municipal ID program. I could talk about this forever and ever again. It's on many different levels. But what were your thoughts about that?
I read that, and I didn't look at it locally so much as looking at the fact that if you look across the country, in state after state. The gerrymandering and the voter suppression, which is, pretty much orchestrated by the GOP, but yet they're always, while they're doing all this voter suppression of the black vote, basically, well, really, they're, on the other hand, they're trying to deflect attention by, blaming immigrants for, millions of illegal votes and, So it's just a way to, when I look at it, it's just a way to deflect attention from what really they're doing, not so much in Illinois, but elsewhere, is just trying to suppress votes. Yeah. And while they're doing that, blaming immigrants for supposedly voting over and over and over again. Yeah.
One thing about Ives, though, I do give her credit. I mean, I think, I saw a tweet yesterday from David Axelrod, because she was down Monday, I believe, at the University of Chicago Institute of Politics, and they were hoping to get Rauner to come down there as well, and that was actually, I think, going to be a possible WBEZ debate, but Rauner didn't want to debate her, and Axelrod, he said, she didn't change any minds, but he praised her for coming there, and I remember, I don't know, maybe 6 weeks ago, her, she needs all the free media she can get, let's face it, but I arranged to go meet her out in Oak Brook for coffee one day, and it was just me and her, no staffers. And it's like, when you get kind of that encounter with somebody running for statewide office, and there's not a press person here, and I mean there was something oddly refreshing about it, because you can really kind of spend a half hour kind of just shooting the breeze about what's inside this person.
Yeah, she's a luxury to do that. I went on essentially a ride along with her from one campaign stop to the next a few weeks ago, and she is very smart. And I think that she is, and she's really good about talking about sort of fiscal conservatism, which I think would resonate actually up into Cook County. But they've obviously, she and her campaign have made a decision. I mean, first of all, she believes a lot of this right-wing social stuff. So she actually does believe it. Like, she has a real problem with getting her head around same-sex marriage and other things like that. I mean, that's just where she is. But they've also made a calculation that if they run a Trump campaign, that they might be able to surprise somebody. So they want to fire up all these people who are concerned about undocumented immigrants, or at least they're going to get, like you said, Lorraine, distracted by this issue. They're certainly trying to fire up the pro-life crowd. And they want in a Republican primary, I was told by one of her supporters, who is Bruce Rauner's base? It's other millionaires. He self-funds. He's spent, in this part, just in the last few years, he's gave himself a $50 million donation a couple years ago. He's still spending that money in this campaign. And they're arguing he doesn't have a natural constituency. So again, say what you will about her, she feels she does have a natural constituency. It is this 25 to 30% of the Republican voters, and she thinks she can fire them up. And if they're unenthused, other Republicans are unenthused about Rauner, they think they can pull something off. I don't know that they can, but that's what they're thinking. And they're like, oh, we would love to get into a general election with J.B. Pritzker and talk about fiscal issues. We would love that. But
what is she saying about, and because I haven't followed, what is she saying about fiscal issues that is going to be so appealing to people?
Oh, you could start with the pensions. She's.
But do people really understand what is the issue with the pensions? The issue with the pensions is borrowing money from pension funds years ago and never paying it back.
So talk about people's taxes.
Fiscal distress.
But my question is, what is different about her message on quote-unquote fiscal issues than Rauner's message? It seems to be that they're preaching the same thing about cutting pensions, for instance, putting a freeze on property taxes. I mean, she supported him down the line on all his initiatives up until HB 40, up until the abortion bill. And so what I'm saying is I can see no difference between Jeannie Ives on what you call fiscal issues, what we're talking about, taxes, et cetera, and Bruce Rauner, right?
There is no difference, but their argument is he's had 4 years and he didn't get it done. And
she's going to get it done, how?
I listen, I'm not on her campaign.
I'm just saying.
You hung out with her. No, but
it wasn't a date, Ben. It was a reporting assignment.
That's pretty funny.
Yeah, I don't know how she. I mean, it's funny because the notion that Jeannie Ives somehow in a general election, I know you don't believe this, but the notion that she could be more persuasive in a general election than Bruce Rauner, considering her ads, you know what I mean? All right, just ignore everything that went before this, you know what I'm saying? This is concentrated on those pensions. There's a real winning issue, the pensions. So it's a hard sell, you know what I'm saying? You've got to really listen to her on pensions.
You're talking about a group of people who think that at this point in time, or want to think that every election is a referendum on Michael Madigan. And so if they have a choice between someone they can present as, I'm going to stand up to Michael Madigan, and even though Bruce Rauner has talked this good talk, he likes to bash unions and all this, he hasn't done anything, versus someone who's like, look, I'm a mom and I'm a West Point grad and all this stuff. I'm going to be tough where he hasn't. And as Dave said, every time a couple times they've had a joint appearance, she's looked pretty good next to Bruce Rauner, you know. So again, I am not defending Jeannie Ives. I find her candidacy fascinating. It's like a moment because exactly what you're saying, Ben. Bruce Rauner from the get-go has been the anti-union candidate, the privatized school candidate, and so forth. And yet the right still came out with someone else because he's not good enough.
You know, think about this for a second, too. I think, these polls we see, the Simon Institute had him up by like 20 points. Mm-hmm. And if it's just a foregone conclusion, that is a wonderful thing for Bruce Rauner because you're coming out of a primary with momentum. You've fended off a challenge from your right. But what happens if this poll is wrong? And what happens if it's a race that's only decided by 5 or 10 points? And then you have an incumbent limping out of a primary. And I'm not saying that's going to happen, but that would be a miraculous political story if somehow she was able to make it close or win. I mean, that would be something I haven't experienced before.
Well, should we talk about the Attorney General race? You brought it up earlier. I cut you off. Who isn't running? Are you guys running? Seems like everybody else is.
Right. I'm not a lawyer.
Anybody out there?
That's the only reason. So. Yeah, there might be a couple out there that are. Yeah, what is it, like 8? 8 people?
Well,
running?
10 total.
Democrat side,
That's 8
yeah.
Democrats, 2 Republicans.
Right, okay. Yeah, wow, that's... Has there ever been that many? Okay, so... Is there a certain percentage, or is it just the top vote getter?
No, it's just a
top
straight up
vote
majority,
getter.
man.
Straight up
So
majority.
yeah, they all
That's
split up the vote.
Yeah.
It's so bewildering. I mean, I always talk about how undecided I am on governor's race. Good God, the attorney general's race. It's like who left the next one I talk to? I think I'll vote for you.
Well, and there's like a few, like what, 3
Isn't
or
that
4 people that maybe most people have heard their names.
Well, there's
but
Pat
most
Quinn,
of them,
yeah.
Most people have heard of course, Pat Quinn and
Actually, I don't
But
know if
actually,
anybody.
that's
There's
like-
Kwame Raoul, but I would
Kwame
bet
Raoul,
you.
Chicagoans know him, but maybe
Maybe. I mean, you got to
and
kind of be in the
Sharon
weeds a
Aaron
little bit.
Fairly and
Yeah, there's, there's
yeah, I know
Pat.
a lot
That's
of
about
them.
I
it.
think the name recognition after Pat drops off pretty
Oh, yeah. I
fast.
mean, you have 2
and
candidates.
I know that the name recognition is helping him.
But boy, you watch the forums with those people, and almost to a 1, it's like you could sort of imagine any of them doing a pretty decent job. I mean, you don't have anybody in that crowd talking about splitting up Illinois into 3 states.
Hey. There's a lot of
You know what?
validity in
After-
that.
after-
Which what you're saying is
Marshall.
there is a candidate who's saying that, Robert Marshall on the
You know what?
Democrats
After
side.
after,
right? Yeah.
after the WBEZ debate ended the other night, he came up and was shaking hands with people and came over to the press table. And I just said, where did you come up with that idea? And he just got kind of this wild-eyed look, and he went, it's like, wow, I don't want to go in there,
I mean, I remember hearing him, I think, present a similar idea when he's running for Senate a few years ago. I mean,
Senate,
so it's one of the
Congress.
guys who runs for anything he can each cycle. But so how does someone emerge from this? I mean, is it Pat Quinn's just because people know the guy's name, or what? What do you guys think?
I don't think that just because people know Pat Quinn's name that they're going to vote for him. I mean, he didn't help him when he was running for governor, so I don't know that it's going to help. Yeah,
What was that, Ben?
I said, I voted for him.
No, but would you vote for him for attorney
Okay, I got a
general?
confession to make, Lorraine. I'm going to tell you this right now. And I've said this before. I see that name, and I'm like, I can't help myself. I've been voting for Pat Quinn for so no. There I go. I vote for him. I like Pat Quinn. I'll be on the record. Some about the guy I like. So whatever.
Yeah, I mean, he's persistent, and it's kind of amazing where I don't know what's in his campaign account now, but a few weeks ago or whatever, I think he had about $400,000 left over from his gubernatorial run. And he's on TV a little bit.
First of all, how did you not spend it all?
Yeah.
It was like down to the wire the last time. Why did
Yeah.
you I'm gonna,
Why'd
you know
walk
what?
out of that?
I'm just gonna save $400,000. Never know. You never know.
But you know what? It's
there
like
it is.
I think. I mean, you look at those two, Raoul and Quinn, and everybody kind of puts them at the top of the pack. But then you've got the 2 women in the race. I think both of them are really impressive candidates. I mean, they're just not. They're not like their problem is they just don't have the resources and name recognition. But Nancy Rotering is You know, we had dinner with some friends from Highland Park last weekend, and they love her as mayor. And then, well, somebody said
audience,
no.
okay.
These people did, but maybe you know more. But that was their take on it. Yeah. And then Sharon Fairley. I mean, people. You know, she's got endorsements.
She's
and
good.
She is
I've
impressive.
heard her speak.
You know,
some Sharon Fairley people
yeah.
here tonight.
Yeah.
I think that's a sign we should get some questions from the audience here. They're already cheering.
All right, should we just, real quick, though, before we do, should we just ask about the Cook County Assessor's race? There's a lot of other races, but the Cook County Assessor's race, I know we talked about it last month, but here we are. Is Joe Barrios going down? I mean, the chairman of the Democratic Party, the assessors, guy's been in politics since the 1960s. He once sat up here on the stage, told us how he got his start in politics when former alderman and ward boss and Richard J. Daley's right-hand man, Tom Keene, fixed a speeding ticket, made a speeding ticket go away for Joe Barrios in return for Joe helping him organize Latinos in his ward. And that's how he got his start in politics, and he's been at it ever since. Is he going down? Is he going down?
Well, the people who vote in primaries are people who are very much into more or less, more engaged with politics, obviously. So, and those tend to be people who are, probably trying to get rid of the old guard. So I wouldn't be surprised.
Well, I mean, I think, you were talking about the Tribune earlier. I mean, they have had, just relentless coverage on his assessment practices.
Right.
And have raised a lot of valid questions
Exactly.
about the way minority communities are assessed versus downtown. And I think there is a compelling narrative out there. And, he had a chink in his armor when his daughter lost the House race. And so he's not invincible. That election proved that.
Ben, what do you think on the assessor's race?
I think we have Andrea Rayla in the audience here. She was on the show last week. I saw her briefly walk through. Nick, I got to tell you, we were having a previous conversation, and Ricky Hendon, former state senator Ricky Hendon, was talking about how he anticipates turnout will really be low in this election. He was talking about that. And he, of course, is a big Fritz Kagi supporter. So just put that out there. But whenever I hear about low turnout in an election, and this gets to what you were saying, it's like the party. That's where they have their advantage, and he is the party. So I'm not. Listen, I'm so bad at predictions, as everybody in this audience knows. So I just am not ready to say just. I know the Tribune's against him, and I know the Sun-Times is against him, and I know everybody like on the North Lakefront is against him, and his name has replaced Stroger's as the name that people feel really good about being against, while they duck the Rahm question. But I'm not ready to call, I don't know. I don't know. I just really don't know.
Yeah. So the theory is in a low turnout election, the party has its regular voters, and they get their marching orders or their loyal voters, and that's who they vote for. So that's certainly what you would think that Joe is hoping for in this election.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, all right, let's get some questions here. We have a mic we'll pass around. Thank you. Sure, right there.
What are the odds of Congressman Danny Davis losing his primary to Anthony Clark?
Danny Davis. I actually haven't heard much about that campaign myself. I wouldn't bet against, personally, I wouldn't bet against Danny K. Davis, but I don't know, anybody else have any insights into his opponent?
I haven't followed that either, but he's one of these, he's been around a long time. People in his district like him,
I don't believe a sitting congressman has ever help me on this. More like a Lipinski, with greater chance that Lipinski would lose to Marie Newman. That may be the first, correct me, I know there's some political junkies in this audience. Has a sitting congressman ever been defeated in a Democratic primary? an incumbent. Oh, Danny Rostenkowski won the Democratic primary, lost the general election. So I don't believe.
Is Reynolds in a primary?
Did Mel Reynolds even get to run in that primary? Because he got in trouble with the underage stuff. And
one way to put it, yes.
yeah, good memory. That was 1995. Then Jesse Jackson Jr. So I don't know if yeah, okay, well, there's not extenuating.
I think to answer your question directly, we haven't heard any buzz about this. It doesn't mean it couldn't happen. All of us, I think, are a little leery, especially after the last presidential election, of weighing in on one, making election predictions. But I agree with you, Ben. What we're hearing, and I think the latest poll that was released, again, you have to know who did the poll and what the details are. Not a polling expert, but the latest poll was that Marie Newman was basically in a dead heat with Dan Lipinski, right?
Yeah. So that could be the first time an incumbent Democrat loses.
Which would be a big deal because Dan, of course, inherited the seat essentially from his dad. And how long was Bill in office? A long time, right?
Before that, he was alderman. So
yeah,
the Lipinski's been around forever.
Who else? Anybody else have questions? Nobody else? All right, there we go.
I want to just go back briefly to the Tribune thing. If you, as a reporter, got JB on the line and talked to him about all kinds of stuff, but didn't tell him you were recording him, you would not be able to use that information, right? Because Illinois is a two-party consent state. So because the government recorded him, does that give the Tribune a free pass to run material that JB did not know he was being recorded in? Doesn't he have a case that his First Amendment rights are being?
Is it his First Amendment rights?
I guess it wouldn't be First Amendment, but one of those amendments.
One of us.
Let's make it the second.
There's some amendment out there that would govern that.
We're pretty sure it's not second.
Yeah, right.
But if the government had an authorized wiretap, then I don't.
Yeah, no,
I'm with you.
I think that's Ken Davis asking that. I'm with him 100% on that.
So the question is the circumstances under which someone acquired the tapes, the recordings, were those illegal? But actually getting them and printing them, I don't know. I can't imagine that that's illegal.
No, I think it's the old cliche, possession's 9/10 of the law, and I don't think they've, I mean, what is JB going to do?
Yeah, it's nothing he can do, right?
Is he going to go sue the Tribune? I mean, that's not going to happen.
What about ethically?
Yeah, there you go. That's the.
What about the ethics of it? Do you guys have any ethical qualms? If you came upon these tapes, would you have any ethical qualms about using them in a story?
You'd have to make sure that they weren't doctored in some way. If you could you verify that? I mean,
let's say you could. Yeah.
Let's say you could. And then what's the content? You judge the content, right? And well, I mean, what if you have evidence on a tape that somebody is, planning to burn down somebody's house or commit a crime? Then it becomes like every case is different. But I don't.
In this case, what would you have done, Dave? You got those tapes.
Well, if I could do those things, if I could verify that they were real, and I could verify, that I was on firm legal footing in publishing, then I think the needle always goes toward publishing.
Yeah, I don't know. I think there's a lot of ethical issues here, and I think the Tribune, at the very least, owes an explanation, more of an explanation than we obtained the tapes, and they should tell us, give us a little more than we've obtained the tapes, and not just hide behind we're protecting our source. People need to know a little bit more, in my humble opinion, the context. And I agree with Ken Davis there. I don't know what the ethics of listen, ethics in journalism and like ethics in Chicago politics. I mean, I don't even know if those words belong together. But
you either think it's ethical to publish them, or you either think it's legal to publish them, or you think it's not legal because
it's clearly legal.
Well, if it's legal, then what's
the ethics?
But no, I mean, if it's legal, why is it unethical? Just because we don't know who they got them from?
No, it's unethical because, as Ken was suggesting, this is you're effectively listening to a conversation that was illegally.
But it was a government wiretap. That's
And
not
it wasn't
illegal.
It wasn't illegally taped to our knowledge.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, if it's a government wiretap, you don't give. I mean, if you were given consent, why would they go and get
But here's to play off the legal or to play off the ethical question here. Let's throw this on the table. I don't know this to be true, but suppose those tapes came from a defense lawyer representing one of the defendants in the case.
Yeah,
that's a strong possibility.
Very possibility.
And
Yeah.
if those tapes are under seal by court order,
Yeah.
and you then know that you have a lawyer who is violating a court order,
There you go.
then what duty do you have to pursue that? I mean, I think it's not an easy question by any means, but I'm just telling you, like.
Well, someone. Let me put it this way: someone to answer that question, I'll shift the blame a little bit or shift the responsibility. Someone in power in the U.S. Attorney's Office knows the number of people who had access to those tapes, at least at one point in time. I mean, if you really want to look into this, there are some breadcrumbs I think you can follow. You alluded it to an earlier date, and I don't know where the tapes came from either. This is all of us, just be clear, we're all surmising.
Yeah.
But one of the lead authors of that story, writers of that story, was a former federal courts reporter who covered the Blagojevich trial. And so he either has a law enforcement source or he either has an attorney source or has someone who was a go-between between a law enforcement source to a law enforcement source or an attorney source. That's been my presumption from the beginning. And so the people who know what's on the tapes and how many tapes there were, and they also know who else had access to them at that point in time. And sure, it's possible they've been thrown around, distributed since then, but I'm just saying if someone really, my guess is that people involved in publishing this story and others also at the U.S. Attorney's Office are aware of where these came from. And they've all decided that at this point in time, it's fair game.
It's fair game,
Yeah,
and
you're right.
and as Lorraine is saying, there's no way Pritzker can, because what he said was so bad and embarrassing. If he like turns this, oh poor me, no one's
Right.
gonna fall for it.
Right. Oh, you just have to suck it up.
You suck it up and go, yeah, you're right. Yeah, but those were unfair. Anyway.
There's another congressional incumbency that's it could potentially be in danger now, and the press has said very little about the primary situation there, and that's Peter Roskam in the 6th. Do you guys know what's going on with all those various candidates?
That's okay. That's not a primary challenge, of course. What you're talking about would be once in November when the Democratic candidate, whoever emerges from that.
We have about 5 or 6 Democratic candidates running
Right.
for the primary.
Right.
And the press hasn't mentioned much of anything about it.
I think they've gotten coverage, but the issue is that the Democrats are all fighting it out right now, and whoever emerges may have a real shot at Roskam in the fall. That's the thinking. So you're right that in some ways it hasn't gotten as much attention, but there's not a sense that at this moment that Congress, that sitting congressman is going to go down. That would be a few months off. That's the thinking. Of course, that is affected by who ends up winning the primary and everything else, but yeah. It's really
That's a great one because I don't know how the Democrats take back the Congress in November if they can't defeat Roskam in the 6th. I mean, as you know, Hillary won that district in November of 2016 in the face of Trump's victory. And, I mean, he voted with Trump on the tax bill. He's anti-choice. He's not spoken out on any of the environmental protection cuts. If that isn't a vulnerable incumbent, I don't know what is. And if the Democrats still manage to blow that one, then I don't know how they can win back the House. What do you think?
I think you're right. But that district, it's got, if I'm remembering the shape of it correctly, I mean it's got. I believe Tom Cullerton's district is in there, and I think it stretches up into Cook. I mean, DuPage is such an interesting place politically. How, think about what it looked like 20 years ago, and you had, Henry Hyde kind of at the top of the pecking order, and Pate Phillip and Lee Daniels and Jim Ryan, and it was like this power center of Illinois politics. But those old guard people just have kind of faded away, and what you now have is a much diminished
Absolutely,
Republican influence there, where it was unthinkable that a guy like Cullerton would be, in play there. So Roscom absolutely faces danger. There's no question.
Yeah, there's about 5 women running against him too, well, in the Democratic primary.
Yeah. All right, next question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
Does the departure of Lisa Madigan have any bearing on the future of Mike Madigan?
Well, you know what? That's a very good question. I to this day, I don't feel like there has been an adequate public explanation by either one of them about what exactly it went down in was it 2013, the summer of 2013, about why she just abruptly, after fundraising to run for governor, pulled the plug. And I'm equally perplexed about what her future is, because I thought that, she kind of had this ability to define her path as this senior face of that party. And, like even a judgeship, a federal judgeship, I thought, well, that might be her. Or maybe, well, any number of things, you guess, but he's got to be out of the way, though. And if he's got a statewide disapproval of whatever it is, 68%. I brought this. I'm not going to find it here, but the amount of the percentage of disapproval in this city for Madigan is pretty staggering too. I mean, it's she's got him just anchored around her neck, unfortunately.
Well, he got her far. As we think about that, she became Attorney General. What do you think? Why do you think she stepped down? No?
I have no idea. No idea. I mean, and she hasn't said anything about what she wants to do next. I mean, maybe who knows? Maybe she wants to be senator. I don't know.
Well, my Republican friends, I got about 3 or 4 of them, they say she realized she couldn't win this race. I'm just telling you what my Republican friends tell me, that she couldn't have won this race, that the negatives for her father are so great.
Crazy. Here's the number. This is just like
Yeah.
staggering, all right? So in the city of Chicago, the percentage of people, according to this Paul Simon Institute poll that came out just a few days ago, 62% of Chicagoans disapprove of Madigan. So right there, that tells you a little bit about the political struggles Lisa has. Even though I think she's been successful in carving out her own identity and doing her own things in that office, and she's got to have a cooling off period, I think.
Next question.
So it keeps getting reported that Pritzker is the only guy who has enough money to beat Rauner. But isn't it the case that no matter who the Democrat comes out of the primary, that he'll get money? Like even, if it were if Pritzker lost, he would give money. If Kennedy lost, he would give money to Biss. And also the National Democratic Party would give money to him. So this reporting about, Pritzker's the only one that has enough money to do that seems to be kind of specious.
Well, I mean, don't forget. I mean, the highway is littered with these, uber wealthy candidates. I mean, none as rich as Pritzker, but does anybody remember Blair Hull or Jack Ryan? I mean, these people, they thought that they thought that money bought them an office, basically, or could buy them an office. But you've got to have substance. You've got to have an ability to work hard. I mean, it's like we've followed these campaigns around, and it's just grueling. And if you'll see candidates who don't think they have to work very hard at it, and they're the ones that are in most danger. I'm not saying that about Pritzker, but I don't think that wealth is necessarily it's not an automatic indicator, because he's just as capable as anybody of screwing things up. I mean, it's human nature. We can all make gaffes. We can make mistakes, and
Well, the thing is, if and I'm not saying that money will buy you an office either, but we'll say Biss or Kennedy gets the nomination, not Pritzker. Is he going to devote the same amount of money to those people that he would to himself? That's why people say, well, Pritzker's the only one with enough money to beat Rauner, because the assumption is you just wouldn't give either of those candidates the same amount of money that he would spend on himself. So.
I can't imagine that he would, or any of the candidates would give one of the other candidates a blank check.
Right.
And
well,
say,
exactly.
spend what you need.
And that's not to say that he, just because he has money, he can waltz in there. That's not the case. But
it's not. And Ben and I have talked about this quite a bit. I actually think that, yes, the Democrats clearly want J.B. The Democrats, by then, I mean the apparatus, clearly wants J.B. Pritzker because they don't have to. They can save that money for something else. I mean, Mike Madigan can save that money to try to preserve his majority, for instance. And so they would much rather have Pritzker spending his own money than them having to come up with it from any other source. But I've said to Ben and to anyone else who would listen, there's not that many, but that I think it's really like you're missing the tone of the times to counter an unpopular multimillionaire who had no experience going into office with a billionaire who has no experience going into office, when there's also a very rich and unpopular guy in the White House who had no experience going to office. I just think it reminds me of when the Democrats nominated Alexei Janulius, the scion of a bank that was failing because they gave out so many bad loans during the housing crisis. They nominate this guy to replace Barack Obama, and of course he lost. I just think it's like you're missing the tone here, and of course, but money speaks. Money speaks volumes.
Next question.
Sadly.
One more question. Yeah.
Alderman Napolitano and others have objected to the use of the new city ID called City Key for use by Chicagoans to register to vote. The premise being that City Key can be given to people who are not citizens, and you have to be a citizen to vote. So I'm wondering what the panelists think about sort of that technical issue of City Key being used to allow people to register to vote who are potentially not citizens.
We touched on this a little bit earlier, but you guys, any take on this? I mean,
I would like to know how big of a problem it is. How big of a problem is it of, undocumented people getting in the voting booth to begin with? That's a key thing that we don't know, and I don't think it happens very often, if at all.
Well, and the city clerk in the story, and I did read the story bit, made it a point to say if you are an undocumented person, don't try and use this to vote because, when you vote, it's on the public record, and ICE asks us for our records, and if you do vote and you're not a citizen and your name is there and ICE sees it, that's a felony to vote when you're not a citizen. So why would you do it and put yourself on record and then, ICE comes and knocks on your door?
It's pretty preposterous on the face of it. I mean, I'm not saying that the city ID is
good or
the
bad.
answer,
I'm just
right?
saying
exactly. But the point of it is to try to give people some sort of valid identification in case they need, let's say, medical care or they have to report a crime or something else, because otherwise that stuff, they don't come forward. That's the whole point. There's a community that is afraid to come forward by and large.
But they're not going to come forward and want to get this ID either, because
Yeah.
I've interviewed people who are undocumented. They don't even want their picture taken or
Right.
anything. So I don't see that this does
But
anything
they
but
might
make it look like, we're trying to do something.
But they might step forward to vote against Jeannie Ives.
Yeah. No, it's a bogus issue manufactured by Jeannie Ives and Napolitano should know better.
Just like I said, while they're suppressing the
yes,
black vote across the nation.
Right. And this feeds this preposterous notion
and over
that somehow or other the reason Trump didn't win the actual vote, this is the Trump line, is because of all these undocumented citizens in California voted. That's the Trump line. And so Jeannie Ives is just feeding that line. And like I said, it's embarrassing that it's funny to say it's something an alderman did is embarrassing above and beyond what they usually do. But this is really embarrassing that he would lend himself to this total. Think about it, Mick. I mean, the turnout in the Hispanic wards is always the lowest in Chicago, and we're just talking about people who could vote if they wanted to, and so it's just so preposterous, and it's just obviously an attempt to, as Lorraine said, feed off prejudice, bigotry, and exploit it.
It's an allegation that itself is not documented. Okay. All right.
Very well done.
We need to wrap it up. I think we would be remiss, though, without just touching on an issue, Dave, you have been reporting on, which is Legionnaire's disease at a veterans home down in the Quincy area. And in case anybody missed it, in the Sun-Times yesterday, they reported that one of the state officials who had testified about this yesterday refused to answer Dave's question. And Dave, do you remember exactly what you were told, why this person refused to answer your question?
Yeah, I think the quote was, "I only talk to journalists with journalistic integrity." And I said, "To whom are you referring?"
Yeah.
And that question was not answered.
Yeah,
right?
that was not answered. But it was
She asked you to FOIA it.
FOIA. It was like it was a classic cat and mouse thing where they had this hearing at the Bolandic building across from the Thompson Center, and these two directors that had been kind of in the thick of all of this had just gotten through testifying, and Mitch Dudek over at the Sun-Times and I posted up outside the hearing room because we had questions from the hearing we wanted to pose to these guys, and they made a decision inside that they were just going to push their way through. They were going to get to the elevators and get the hell out of Dodge. And so when it was clear that was happening, there was a lot of body blocking going on, as we're walking along and we're throwing questions at them, and they, they're not answering anything, and then they get to the elevator bank, and none of the elevators will open, so they're stuck. And so then their plan B is to go to the right and go to a freight elevator, and this is even worse for them because then we're basically able to sort of trap the Veteran Affairs director in this little cubby hole, and she can't get out, and that's when she said that. And yeah, it's sort of like, an enemy of the people, I guess. That's what we're all proud of, but I don't know. This is a problem that's not going away, and as long as people keep getting sick there, and there's not a clear-cut plan how to deal with it, it's a problem. And the thing, I don't really understand how somebody can question my integrity on an issue like this, because this story it's not been my voice that's told this story. I mean, in a technical sense, it has. I'm the one on the air that has said it along with Tony Arnold, but it's the voice of these families. There were 13 people who died, and what we've heard over and over and over again. These people, they get sick. There's a big mystery as to what they have, and they're not getting tested quickly enough for Legionnaires. And the whole thing is the state knew days earlier that there was Legionnaires there, and they weren't telling families of these people who were getting sick. And you hear these families. We interviewed several of them in Quincy. And the one that really sticks in my mind is this guy he was 94, so granted, he is in the twilight of his life, but he was still coherent, still taking walks, and his life story, you listen to it, and it made me want to cry, because this guy, in World War II, he was in the Army, and he was a tail gunner on a B-17 bomber, and they were on this raid to take out a munitions factory in Munich, and they, on the way there, they encounter this air fight. And this plane they're in just gets riddled with bullets, and there are 5 other crew members on it. And all 5 of these people, including the pilot and co-pilot, are shot dead while the plane is just going like this, And here's this guy is in the back of the plane in a parachute that he has never tried before and doesn't know if it works and is struggling to get out as sparks are flying at him. This is all, he documented all of this in a book that he wrote, that he self-published. And he just jumps, and he pulls the rope, and nothing happens. This is it. And then, after a few more moments, up the plume goes, the parachute, and he starts drifting down. And he gets close to the ground, and these Nazis are on the ground with machine guns, and they're firing at him, And he somehow evades getting shot through all of these bullets flying through the air, and then is taken as a prisoner of war to this prison camp in Austria, Stalag 17, which is one of the worst of World War II. And he survives there for 13 months, part-time solitary confinement, eating bugs. That's what this guy did, And he winds up getting out, getting saved, and moves to Quincy, raises a family, has 3 girls and a son, he builds a life for himself. And then when the end of his life comes, he knew that he couldn't take care of himself anymore, and he was proud to go into this facility. It's a beautiful facility. It opened in 1886, and it's not far from the Mississippi River. I mean, this place, when it opened, was caring for Civil War veterans. And so, he was proud to go there. And then this little germ that he breathed in through a shower or through a whirlpool or through a sink took him out, and he was in the state's care. And it's like, you can survive the trauma of that extreme trauma of war, but not that. And it was like, wow. And so, for somebody, I mean, these, in fairness to these guys with the state, they believe that they have taken steps to make the water safer there. They believe that, they've spent a lot of money trying to do it, but yet people still keep getting sick. And, I don't care if people insult me. I don't care. It's like the voices of these family members are the ones that really are dominating this story. And to their credit, it's like another one in Springfield we talked to who, his mom and dad went over there because they couldn't afford a nursing home, and the dad was a veteran, and she was in her late 70s. She had, she had, like, I forget what her issue was. It was not a debilitating thing, but she was a little frail, but still getting around and doing great in her 70s, typical 70s. And she would go to her husband's room 8 hours a day basically and just sit with him. He had Parkinson's, and then the son in Springfield hears on the radio that there's a Legionnaires outbreak over there, and so he picks up the phone immediately and calls the place, and they say, look, if you haven't heard from us, there's no problem. And so he kind of goes to bed that night thinking everything's okay, and then the next morning the phone rings, and it's the home again, and they're like, your mom's friends say she's been missing, and we want permission to go into her room. And they go into her room that Saturday morning, and there she is lying on the floor, and she had been dead for the coroner I talked to. She'd been dead for 36 to 48 hours, and it was a horrible story because this woman was otherwise healthy. She had been, shopping at Kohl's and going out to lunch with her son the week before, and then it just, you hear story after story after story, and it's like, this is our state of Illinois.
Well, it's a difficult note to end on, but we are grateful.
Somebody tell a joke now about that.
We're grateful for your reporting, Dave. Lorraine, we're grateful for all the work you've done and look forward to your imprint being on the Sometimes editorial page. Thanks to all you guys for being here, for going. We went quite a bit longer today, but man, you guys are great. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much.
Thanks to Chris Buddy for videotaping. Thanks to the Hideout staff for having us. And we'll see you guys next month.